In the stories that shaped the week, deadlock over Syria. The U.S. threatens to halt cooperation with Russia and fires claims at Moscow.
Russia will continue to send troops home in body bags.
At the same time, a leaked recording emerges of the U.S. Secretary of State expressing frustration about having to use diplomacy in Syria rather than being able to deploy the military to oust President Assad. Also ahead, Russia says the MH17 probe lacks hard evidence and fails to identify the exact type of missile used. The investigation claims the plane was hit by a missile from Russia, which was fired from a rebel-held village in eastern Ukraine. And oil prices pick up as producers finally agree to cut production for the first time in 8 years. Live from Moscow, this is The Weekly, a wrap-up of the past 7 days' top news stories. I'm Ewan O'Neill. Welcome to the programme. The U.S. threatened this week to end cooperation with Moscow in Syria unless, quote, Russian and Syrian attacks on the city of Aleppo stop. An ultimatum was made in a phone call between American Secretary of State John Kerry and his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov. The U.S. State Department also said it's looking at non-diplomatic avenues for responding to the situation.
Extremist groups will continue to exploit the vacuums that are there in Syria to expand their operations, which will include, no question, attacks against Russian interests, perhaps even Russian cities. And Russia will continue to send troops home in body bags.
And those words by John Kirby didn't go unnoticed by Moscow. One official called such comments inappropriate for a diplomat.
Don't you think that such ventriloquism about body bags, terrorist attacks in Russian cities and loss of aircraft sounds more like a get 'em command rather than a diplomatic comment?
Of course, you can continue to try and convince everyone that they're trying unsuccessfully to separate al-Nusra terrorists from the opposition. Once again, I would say that we are fully ready to continue dialogue with our American partners and cooperate in the fight against terrorists in Syria. However, any threats to our servicemen, or even hints of such threats, are absolutely inappropriate in this dialogue.
Well, that's as the U.S. Secretary of State said Russia was responsible for the worsening situation in Syria. The conflict has indeed escalated since the U.S.-Russia brokered ceasefire collapsed 2 weeks ago. It ended partly as a result of Washington blaming Moscow for an attack on a UN aid convoy, an allegation Russia rejects. However, even while the deal was still in force, well over 100 violations were attributed to the US-backed opposition. One of the biggest rebel groups, Ahrar al-Sham, refused to comply with the agreement at all. RT's Gaine Chichikan asked the State Department why it's insisting Moscow was responsible for the failure of the ceasefire.
Looking at the events that followed the ceasefire, how is it fair to say that Russia is solely responsible for the failure of this deal?
Because, and we've said this many, many times, they have influence on Assad. I didn't make that up.
Are you saying that you don't have influence with the rebels?
We do, and so do some of our allies and partners as well.
And if the U.S. does have influence with these rebel groups, why the hundreds of ceasefire violations? Why did that happen?
We have influence over some, not all. We have there are
largest rebel group just refused to abide by that deal.
There are other nations that have influence, and again, we have admitted that not all the opposition groups on every single day completely abided by it.
Can you admit that part of the responsibility for the failure of this deal lies with the rebels and with the U.S.?
I think we've been nothing but honest about the fact that there have been violations of the ceasefire and the cessation of hostilities on all sides.
While essentially admitting that the U.S. had not delivered on its responsibilities under this deal, the U.S. now threatens to cut ties with Moscow. Washington says that way it wants to stop Russia's bombing of civilians in Aleppo. And this prompted some of my questions on whether the U.S. is consistent in that regard when it comes to dealing with other countries.
The U.S. has expressed grave concern over what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen by hitting civilian targets there. Why isn't the U.S. threatening to cut ties with Saudi Arabia?
We have, the Secretary talked about this when we were in Jeddah a few weeks ago. We have been honest with the Saudis about our concerns over the lack of precision in some strikes, and we've talked to them about the importance of conducting investigations.
But Saudi Arabia is doing there what Russia is accused of doing in Syria. So
No.
How is that consistent?
Because what we're seeing the Russians do. And I would love to see you ask your government some of these questions. You know, Russia today never does that. You never poke and prod your own government.
Go on in a
But
you attack me when you want to evade a question.
No, I'm not attacking you. I'm not attacking you.
From that.
I'm not attacking you. I would just love to see your institution ask these same kind of questions of your own government.
This is not the first time John Kirby tries to evade my questions by changing the conversation to RT. Is it? I'm sorry. Should I not be asking what the U.S. assessment of Turkish actions
I'm going to take this one, Asha, then I'm going to come to you.
Should I not be asking that question? Exactly which question should I be embarrassed about, sir?
You can ask me whatever you want. I'm just stunned that you're not embarrassed by some of the questions you ask. And I notice that RT very rarely asks any tough questions of their own government.
The U.S. strike that reportedly killed around 20 civilians in the ISIL-held city of Manbij in Syria, was it a mistake on Monday?
That's another great accusatory question you've asked here.
Needless to say, this is not going to stop me from asking the State Department questions which I think are fair and informative for our viewers. In Washington, I'm Ganesh Chekyan, RT.
Well, there was a development away from the cameras on Saturday. The New York Times published a leaked conversation between the U.S. Secretary of State and a group of Syrian civilians, which took place behind closed doors at the UN. It reveals John Kerry's frustration at not being able to use might to remove President Assad from power.
I've argued for the use of force. I stood up. I'm the guy who stood up and announced we're going to attack Assad because of the weapons. And then, you know, things evolved into a different process. We're trying to pursue diplomacy, and I understand it's frustrating. You have nobody more frustrated than we are.
John Kerry mentioning that he would have preferred the military option to topple Assad contradicts previous statements. In regular talks with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, Mr. Kerry's often said that the U.S. saw only a political solution for Syria. And it does seem that Mr. Kerry is not the only one frustrated over developments in Syria. An interview has emerged showing an alleged commander from the terror group formerly known as al-Nusra saying that opposition groups are not receiving enough support indirectly from America. He's demanding a greater supply of advanced U.S. weaponry.
Yes, the U.S. supports the opposition, but not directly. They support the countries that back us. However, we are still not satisfied with this support. They should support us with advanced weapons. We were winning the fights thanks to Tau missiles. With these, we gained parity with the regime. We received tanks from Libya via Turkey and multiple rocket launching systems too. The regime's only advantage is tactical aircraft, rockets, and rocket launchers. We captured some of the rocket launchers and received a lot from abroad. Thanks to the Tau missiles, we are able to keep the situation under control in many areas.
The interviewee also said that the jihadists didn't recognize the ceasefire in Syria and used it instead to regroup. He went on to say that U.S. instructors had been teaching radicals how to use new equipment.
Between you and the United States.
We got the missiles directly. They were delivered to a certain group. When the road was closed and was encircled, we had officers from Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the U.S. here.
Doing what?
They were experts on how to use satellites, missiles, reconnaissance operations, and thermal observation cameras.
Also American advisors?
Yes, there were experts from many countries.
Also American?
Yes.
Well, we spoke exclusively to journalist Jürgen Todenhofer, who personally interviewed the alleged al-Nusra commander.
The scenery was not very inviting. It was in a mine, in shooting distance of Jabhat al-Nusra forces, Al-Qaeda forces. And there was a moment when our driver thought we were trapped. He said in the film, they got us. because I had an appointment with the commander, but I didn't know that he would come with 10 fighters. It's not the first time that I meet a leader of the rebels. I met a leader of the Taliban twice. I was in the Islamic State. I was the only Western author who was 10 days in the Islamic State. I spoke with leaders of Jaish al-Islam because I think you have to speak with everybody to understand the conflict.